Have you ever wondered what really happened behind the curtains of the Roman palaces? If you think ancient Rome was only an era of glory and epic constructions, get ready to see the other side of history. In this video, we will reveal the darkest sexual horrors committed by emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Tiberius, through rituals of extreme pleasure, cruel punishments, and practices that history tried to hide. You will understand how sick desire, the thirst for power, and the absence of moral limits transformed the Roman Empire into a true theater of perversion and pain. If you are seeking answers about the darkest secrets of Rome and want to discover how these practices impacted the fate of an entire empire, stay with me until the end, because what comes next will shock you profoundly. But before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos filled with historical curiosities about ancient Rome. Imagine an emerging city that would transform into the most dominant force in the ancient world. Want to discover how it all began? Let's go back to the roots and understand what made Rome become the most feared and admired empire of its time. The birth of a powerful empire, Rome, began as a small community of shepherds along the banks of the Tiber River. Over the centuries, this modest settlement grew into a pulsating center of commerce and military strategy. According to legends, it was founded by Romulus and Remus, brothers raised by a she-wolf, which already hinted at a people whose myths were intrinsically linked to brute strength and cunning. As the city expanded, it adopted cultural practices from the different peoples it conquered. This included architectural techniques, arts of warfare, and naturally, their conceptions of morality and sexuality. Over the decades, the Romans not only absorbed these customs, but also refined them, creating their own laws to regulate everything, from taxes to intimate acts. Rome's power was not limited to the conquest of territories. Roman legislation was one of the most complex of its time, establishing a set of rigid norms that, at the same time, clearly defined the limits between what was considered legal and what violated social order. Punishment was swift for anyone who dared cross these limits, and we are not talking only about foreign enemies, but also Roman citizens. From these foundations, the Roman Empire consolidated itself as a colossal machine, capable of governing millions of inhabitants across different continents. Behind all its grandeur, there was a Senate that was sometimes weak in the face of the emperor, who could decide everything, from wars to marriages. But that was just the beginning. Now that we understand how Rome reached the top, how did this unchecked power reflect in the daily life and the secret pleasures of its rulers? Get ready. The truth is darker than you imagine. Power and its effects on imperial behavior. When a single man assumes almost divine power, inevitable consequences arise. In Rome, the emperor was seen as a sacred entity, capable of controlling even the course of faith. Caligula, for example, made it a point to remind everyone that his word was law. Even at a young age, he already exhibited fits of rage and extravagant whims, wearing luxurious period garments to assert his authority and distinguish himself from the masses. Nero, in turn, became a controversial figure from the start. He combined a passion for the arts, organizing musical and poetic performances, with a cruel streak that led him to persecute anyone who challenged his artistic inspirations. The Senate often found itself powerless to curb his whims, as the only voice that truly mattered was that of a young sovereign who saw himself almost as a demigod. Tiberius, older and battle-worn, chose to isolate himself on Capri. But his absences from Rome did not mean inactivity. On the contrary, reports suggest he organized private parties marked by extreme acts of lust and violence. What happened behind the walls of his villa remained an enigma to the people. Legend had it that political enemies and those out of favor mysteriously disappeared, and few dared to investigate. Meanwhile, Commodus seemed intent on surpassing his predecessors in extravagance. Instead of making state decisions, he was more interested in fighting as a gladiator, donning Roman imperial armor to appear before crowds. In the arenas, he experienced the thrill of being ordinary, but in real life, he demanded divine treatment. Have you ever wondered how this mix of absolute power and intense personalities affected personal relationships and the way rewards or punishments were administered? Let's dive deeper to understand who these emperors truly were and how their lifestyles shocked society. Behind the scenes of the court, family, feasts, and excesses. Behind all the imperial pomp, there were the backstage intrigues of the court, filled with conspiracies, forged alliances, and silent enemies. It was common for emperors to host sumptuous banquets, where wine flowed without moderation and music echoed through marble halls. In many cases, these parties turned into scenes of seduction games and acts of extreme intimacy in public, viewed as normal by the elite present. Imperial. Families were also marked by internal disputes. Claudius, despite his more fragile image, had to deal with ambitious relatives like Agrippina, who conspired to protect her son Nero. Banquets became the ideal moment for gossip and weaving plots against anyone who threatened the succession or defied the ruler's whims. Part of these social gatherings included the display of new slaves, considered mere objects of desire or tools for labor. Social status determined who could dominate whom, be it economically, politically, or sexually. The environment was so permissive for the elite that the use of slaves in exhibitions was even reported by some historians as a morbid form of entertainment. There were also beauty contests, dance competitions, and performance acts that could shock the most conservative. However, within the court, what truly mattered was keeping the emperor satisfied. Any sign of the ruler's discontent could mean exile or worse, summary execution. If life within the palace already seemed like a theater of excesses, imagine how sexuality and social hierarchy intertwined in the less noble neighborhoods of Rome. Let's discover how these relationships were more complex than one might imagine. Sexuality and hierarchy in ancient Rome. Sexuality in Rome was defined not only by gender, but mainly by social position. Being active or passive, dominant or submissive, reflected the scale of power. Caligula, for example, was famous for not caring about the gender of his partners, as long as he could assert his authority over them. This behavior left the Senate bewildered, yet few dared to openly criticize him. Free Roman men held the right to have relations with virtually anyone from a lower class, including slaves and foreigners, without major moral repercussions. However, if the roles were reversed, the punishment could be terrifying, sometimes even resulting in castration or exile. This created a constant tension around relationships that deviated from the norm imposed by society. Among women, the situation was even more delicate. Free Roman women, whether married or not, lived under the watchful eyes of fathers and husbands. Meanwhile, slaves were entirely subject to their masters' desires. At parties, it is reported that they were offered as entertainment with no control over their own bodies. The female status was, in most cases, limited to fulfilling the wishes of men. Despite everything, some accounts indicate the existence of couples who united out of love and tried to live discreetly. However, this was the exception rather than the rule, and many risked their lives if their relationship went against political or religious interests. What happened when someone broke the rules? What were the punishments and spectacles that Rome offered to its people? Get ready to discover the darkest side of a society obsessed with maintaining power. The spectacle of punishment, cruelty and control. Just as Roman feasts could be splendid, the punishments meted out to the condemned were equally theatrical, but in a darker sense. From public crucifixions to spectacles in the Colosseum, the Romans perfected forms of torture that served as warnings to anyone daring to challenge the system. The public, both horrified and fascinated, gathered in large numbers to witness these events. Crucifixion was undoubtedly one of the most well-known methods. It was a slow and painful death designed to humiliate the condemned publicly. Another, reported cruel punishment was sewing the prisoner inside a dead animal, leaving him exposed to the sun and decomposition, something so shocking that many chroniclers could hardly describe it in detail. The goal, to instill fear and demonstrate the inexorable force of Roman law. Some of these practices varied according to the region or the emperor's will. Nero, for example, was known for his cruel creativity, using gardens and nocturnal parties to expose Christians as human torches. Commodus preferred to display his power within the gladiatorial arenas, sometimes personally punishing those he considered traitors. All of this reinforced the idea that disobeying Roman order could cost more than life. It could cost honor and dignity, and for many slaves and lower-class citizens, the mere accusation of a crime was enough for a sentence with no return. Have you ever wondered how these events shaped the fate of such a powerful empire? Hit the like button now so we can continue bringing you stories as impactful as this one. But Rome was not made up of punishments alone. The struggle for power and the control of customs also revealed tales of intrigue and conspiracy. Let's find out what happened behind the Senate's columns and the royal chambers. Political intrigues and conspiracies in the Senate. The Roman Senate, composed of the society's elite, lived in constant tension with the emperors. These senators were influential men, owners of vast properties and victorious ex-generals. The institution, in theory, was meant to balance the sovereign's power. But in practice, many succumbed to imperial whims to maintain their privileges. It was common for groups of senators to secretly conspire against rulers deemed excessively tyrannical. Caligula faced at least 2 serious conspiracies, while Nero, paranoid, ordered the execution of several Senate members on suspicion of treason. Whether there was evidence or not didn't matter. It was enough for the emperor to feel threatened. The exchange of favors was also part of the political game. Bribes, promises of marriage to relatives, and even secret non-aggression pacts were methods to keep allies close. Tiberius, reclusive on Capri, monitored the Senate from afar through trusted men, and whenever he suspected something, he retaliated without mercy. Despite the dangers, some senators fought to keep the Roman institution standing, believing that absolute power in the hands of one man could lead to the empire's collapse. In many cases, their voices were quickly silenced, but the flame of political resistance never completely went out. Conspiracies and betrayals in the Senate left trails of fear in Rome. But what about on a more intimate level, when love entered the scene? Was there room for true feelings amid so much cruelty? Forbidden love and its consequences. Beyond relationships of domination, there were those who genuinely fell in love, even when social hierarchy imposed nearly insurmountable barriers. Soldiers and slaves, patricians and plebeians, some risked everything to live romances that defied Roman conventions. The stories of forbidden love were whispered through corridors, as few had the courage to admit them publicly. Amid this, if a free man was accused of yielding to a slave or a lower-ranking soldier, the penalty could be devastating. His honor would be tarnished, and the rumor would spread like wildfire. Many resorted to bribery or hasty escapes to avoid scandals reaching the ears of the emperors. Certain high society women also faced similar dilemmas. Although raised for arranged marriages, some engaged in extramarital affairs with gladiators or common men. If discovered, They could be banished or even condemned to public punishments, as they represented a direct affront to family honor and morality. Even so, the flame of love remained alive in many hearts. Secret letters, clandestine meetings, and coded messages were part of the daily life of those daring enough to defy the rules. Some of these stories ended in tragedy, but others remain unknown, buried in secrets that Rome never revealed. After exploring the intrigues of love, how about understanding how the lower classes dealt with such vast disparities in power and wealth? Social discontent might have been the spark for major changes. Forbidden love and its consequences. Beyond relationships of domination, there were those who genuinely fell in love, even when social hierarchy imposed nearly insurmountable barriers. Soldiers and slaves, patricians and plebeians, some risked everything to live romances that defied Roman conventions. The stories of forbidden love were whispered through corridors, as few had the courage to admit them publicly. Amid this, if a free man was accused of yielding to a slave or a lower-ranking soldier, the penalty could be devastating. His honor would be tarnished, and the rumor would spread like wildfire. Many resorted to bribery or hasty escapes to avoid scandals reaching the ears of the emperors. Certain high society women also faced similar dilemmas. Although raised for arranged marriages, some engaged in extramarital affairs with gladiators or common men. If discovered, they could be banished or even condemned to public punishments, as they represented a direct affront to family honor and morality. Even so, the flame of love remained alive in many hearts. Secret letters, clandestine meetings, and coded messages were part of the daily life of those daring enough to defy the rules. Some of these stories ended in tragedy, but others remain unknown, buried in secrets that Rome never revealed. After exploring the intrigues of love, how about understanding how the lower classes dealt with such vast disparities in power and wealth? Social discontent might have been the spark for major changes. The twilight of a giant, conflicts and legacies. As the Roman Empire expanded across vast frontiers, internal crises became increasingly evident. Emperors like Commodus wasted resources on spectacles and games, while Tiberius ruled in seclusion, distrustful of everyone around him. The people began to realize that Rome's brilliance hid deep fissures. Loyal generals started contesting orders they deemed senseless, and, in some cases, even attempted to usurp the throne. The Imperial civil wars dealt another blow to Rome's political stability. When an emperor showed weakness, another would soon arise, proclaiming himself the new savior of the empire. Meanwhile, the more distant provinces longed for greater autonomy, feeling that Rome was draining resources without offering effective protection. The sense of abandonment grew, encouraging rebellions and regional pacts that gradually undermined imperial unity. At one point, the empire's machine seemed too vast to be managed cohesively. Yet despite so many difficulties, Rome still boasted military and cultural glories. Amphitheaters remained packed, aqueducts supplied the cities, and Roman law expanded as a model of jurisprudence. But stability hung by a thread, and it took just one incapable or excessively cruel emperor to ignite the flame of popular revolt. We have reached the decisive moments. After all, how did all these plots of power, lust, pain, and resistance shape Rome's future and leave their marks on human history? Let's discover that in our final topic. The dark legacy and the end of a cycle. Over the centuries, Rome succumbed to invasions, economic crises, and political fragmentation, culminating in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But even after its decline, the Roman legacy lived on in many aspects, in law, engineering, language, and, unfortunately, in punishment and torture practices that would be replicated in later periods. The history of emperors like Caligula and Nero became symbols of power excess, showing what happens when there are no clear limits to authority. The cruel feasts and spectacles once celebrated became examples of how the pursuit of personal satisfaction can lead to the ruin of an entire society. On the other hand, popular struggles, slave revolts, and resistance within the Senate serve as reminders that even in the darkest periods, there are those who fight for justice and dignity. These voices, though stifled at the time, would inspire future generations to question tyrannical leaders and demand fairer systems. The final act of this grand empire was a mixture of glory and tragedy. While the Romans taught us about the greatness of engineering and law, they also left us lessons that unchecked power brings devastating consequences. And it is at this point that we conclude our journey through Rome's hidden corridors, aware that cruelty and the thirst for power are not just relics of the past. They can resurface at any moment. We have reached the end of this intense journey through the shadowy corridors and luxurious halls of the Roman Empire. We saw how power, when concentrated in the hands of a few, can lead to unimaginable acts of cruelty and unbridled pleasure. At the same time, we explored the other side, the resistance of simple people and the attempt to keep the spirit of justice alive amid oppression. If you enjoyed this journey through time and want more fascinating stories, subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. About ancient Rome and the entire historical universe we still have to explore.